All right, friends, so you've just learned about the different structures in the brain and kind of what their major responsibilities are, right? But so far, we haven't really connected it much with teaching and learning, except a little bit there with the hippocampus and the amygdala. So let's take a minute to really think through why we as teachers would care about each of these parts of the brain. So I'm going to walk you through really fast. And these are just kind of some of my musings and some of the reading that I've done and research that I've done and things like that allow us to think about the implications of this knowledge for us as teachers. So if we start back there in the brainstem, there's something funky going on with that label, but down here in the brainstem, we have a couple of important structures that we should be aware of as teachers. So probably the most important one is called the reticular activating system. It's up inside of there. It's a bundle of nerves that runs through the brainstem. And really its primary role is with regard to kind of our basic attention mechanisms, what we call cognitive arousal. So that reticular activating system is very attuned to two major types of things. One of them is routine. So it feels comfortable and safe and lovely within familiar routines. And so that suggests to us as teachers that we do build some structure and routines into our classes so that students can feel safe and comfortable in our class and kind of know what to expect. But on the other end of the spectrum, we're going to fall asleep, right? if it's all routine all the time. And so the other thing that the reticular activating system is really attuned to is novelty, when something happens that's out of the ordinary. So that also reminds us that we need to have a balance between those two. That we have some nice, safe structures and routines within our class that kids can get used to, but then we add these pops of novelty to it. So we change up the setup of the room for a day, or we have an unusual object that we're going to focus on, or you come in costume, or whatever it may be, but we're balancing that idea of routine and novelty. And then there are some other things that it is attuned to focus on. One of the most important things is basically we're attuned to respond to our names. And this seems really simple and basic, but it's really essential that we use students' names in the classroom. On the one hand, there's that sense of safety, right? That somebody knows who I am and knows that I'm here and they're using my name. But on the other hand, it's also very much about kind of focusing in attention. So if I use a student's name, suddenly they're alert, right? And unfortunately, a lot of us as teachers put a student's name at the end of a question that we ask. So we say something like, what is the function of the brainstem, Susie? And Susie just freaked out because she wasn't paying attention to my question, and then all of a sudden heard her name, and her reticular activating system was like, that's you. And she started paying attention, but she has no clue what you just asked her, right? So just making a super simple switch of putting names at the beginning of statements and questions. If you're talking to students, tell them that you're talking to them in advance so that their attention is attuned to you throughout that conversation, okay? So that's the reticular activating system. Also built into the brainstem are the mechanisms that control our circadian rhythms, our sleep-wake cycles. And this actually gets really important in adolescence. Maybe you've seen some of the headlines coming out lately about advocating for later school start times for middle schoolers and high schoolers. Hopefully you've seen those headlines. We're seeing more of them, which is awesome. So the thing is that circadian rhythm, the sleep-wake cycle for young kids, has them falling asleep. The melatonin's being released and they're falling asleep, somewhere around 8 o'clock at night. If they stay up much past that, they're cranky and difficult. The same thing happens with adults, right? So adults, melatonin is released, their brain starts to tell them to go to sleep, usually around 10 o'clock at night. So teens actually get all kind of switched up. So their melatonin doesn't release until about 10, 11 o'clock at night, meaning they're really not feeling sleepy. It's not that they're just trying to rebel and like show their independence. Their bodies really are not feeling tired until at least 10, 11 o'clock at night, sometimes a little bit later. And unfortunately, they still need a good solid 9 to 10 hours of sleep a night in order to fully kind of restore everything in their brain and body, and kind of sustain the development that's taking place. So we're really damaging children with the current practices we have of starting middle schools at like 8 o'clock in the morning, and especially our tendency to start high school so early. My kids go to school at 7:30 in the morning, or they have to be there by 7:30 in the morning. So this is really, really problematic as far as kids' sleep-wake cycles are concerned. And we're finding it's actually impacting them across all aspects. So not only is their academic performance suffering, but their mental health, their physical health, I mean, like literally social, emotional, every domain that we can measure is improved when we have later start times for schools. So really starting to look for and advocate for more like an 8:30 to 9 o'clock start time for high schools. Yes, that shifts some things in the after school hours. But it's really vital to start thinking about how we could make that happen for our kids. Okay, so those are kind of the major things for education down there in the brainstem. As we move up into the cerebella, we realize, those are those structures that are largely in charge of automaticity throughout the body, but they also help us out in the brain. So there are some things that we want our students to learn to what we call a level of automaticity, meaning they literally don't have to use their hippocampi, their working memory, to process that information anymore. It just comes to them, right? So as we think about the cerebellum, and it's not all stored back there, but just using that as a cue for us to remember that automaticity is important, that there are certain things that we should help our kids kind of overlearn so that they don't have to think about it. They can just draw up that information at a moment's notice. The most obvious example of that is math facts. If you have your times tables down, you can do math much more quickly, which means you can do more complex math. And that's the part that a lot of people kind of skip over and don't realize. So we're like, why are we having kids do timed mathematics exercises? And I'm not the hugest fan of those all the time, but learning math facts to a level of automaticity then allows them to perform math faster so that then they can perform more complex mathematics. And that's where we're trying to get kids to. So each of us should be thinking about within our disciplines, what are some things we want kids to learn to a level of automaticity? Now, in physical subjects like ASL, like dance, like physical education, of course, etc., vocal performance, instrumental performance, there are certain things we actually physically want to learn to a level of automaticity, and the cerebellum is hugely involved in this. So thinking what those things are and realizing, though, that if we learn them incorrectly, it can be really hard to unlearn them. So this will be really vital to help kids learn those physical skills, but also cognitive skills that we want them to master at a level of automaticity right the first time. They've got to get it right the first time. So really working with them on the details and the techniques so that they've mastered those appropriately. All right, so moving up into the occipital lobes. Part of the realization here as we go through these different lobes of the brain and their functions is simply that different types of information are stored in different places. So as you learned about the brain and learning and the creation of those neural pathways, we were talking about literal physical pathways that are spanning all different areas of the brain. So if I'm teaching visual in a visual way or visual information, the networks that are created, the neural pathways, will actually be created back into these occipital lobes and throughout these occipital lobes. So if I'm giving students a visual like I'm giving to you right now, what I'm doing right now is actually called dual coding, which means I'm using verbal information along with a visual to help support it. You're going to store neural pathways to this image back there in those occipital lobes. And that's going to be really helpful for you to retrieve that information later. So we found that using a process of dual coding like I'm doing right now actually helps you retain the information up to 50% better than you would have if I just talked at you. Okay. So that the occipital lobes in particular are a good reminder to do that, to have some dual coding happening in your classroom using multiple modes of instruction so that kids are creating pathways throughout the brain. The other thing to keep in mind is that our visual processing takes up about 50% of our brain processing power, okay? The actual energy that the brain is using. About 50% of it is going to processing visual information. This is not new. So we keep hearing this, that like kids are more visual learners now, and that's not necessarily true. The world is much more visual as far as like rapid stimuli and lots of stimuli. So there's that, and they're becoming more fluent at kind of efficiently processing those messages, those visual messages. But we, as a species, have always been very visual, right? We needed to constantly be on the lookout for predators and food and all kinds of stuff. So we've always been very, very visual. And that means that it is, again, much more effective if you can bring visuals into your instruction. That does not mean words on a PowerPoint slide. Words are actually very, very complex in the brain. Reading is very complex. There's no reading place in the brain. It's actually kind of hijacked from a bunch of different locations. And so for people like me who subvocalize, I take each of those letters and each of those words and have to like sound them out in my head to be able to understand what's going on. I've gotten pretty good at it. But our brains do that. Like each of those letters or each of those words is a visual that we're then having to process. And so that's really complex and difficult. Much better if we can limit the words on the slides and add more helpful visuals. All right. So that's occipital lobes. Okay, we get up to the parietal lobes, and when we're talking about teenagers, parietal lobes are my absolute favorites. So as we look at the parietal lobes, this band right here, this fold in the brain, is what we call the sensosomatic cortex. So this is where you kind of feel things on your body. That's just an FYI for kicks. The rest of this, we talked about it being kind of a place of integration, where it's integrating things from a lot of different senses and stimuli and sources. But as we get up in here, this is the coolest spot. So if we ask students, for example, to think about themselves, this is a key area that's going to light up. It's kind of, we call it the seat of the self, like where our self resides. So as we think about ourselves and our place in the world and those kinds of things, we're talking about this little area of the brain right here. And interestingly, we've found that there's a really strong connection as you go through your intelligence module in a couple of weeks, or maybe next week. You will see that the most recent neuroscientific definition of intelligence finds a link between the frontal lobes, where we're thinking about, you know, our actions and the consequences of those actions and making plans for the future, those kinds of things. So the frontal lobes through to the parietal lobes. So there's this dialogue that happens as we're kind of associating the stimuli that are coming in, our sense of ourselves and our role within whatever's taking place, and the higher order kind of complex thinking that goes on. And then there's some connection into the midbrain as well. So there's this cool kind of like C-shaped, backward C-shaped entity that we look at with regard to intelligence. So it's kind of fascinating to realize that. But what's also interesting, and you'll learn a bit more about this in the next page of the lesson, is that this seat of the self is highly developing during adolescence. And so the more we can connect what they're learning to not just personal interest, that'll help, but really the role they want to play in the world and who they perceive themselves as being, all of that kind of stuff, the more we can connect our instruction to them, their identities, their plans for the future, the better it's going to stick, the more motivated they're going to be to learn it. Okay? All right, we skip over to the temporal lobes, and there's a ton of stuff back in there, but we're focusing mostly on oral and linguistic skills or verbal processing, etc. As we go in here. So again, it's a good reminder that we need to be using different ways of presenting content to help enhance learning, because we'll get, if we're presenting verbal and visual at the same time with that dual coding idea, then we're going to get pathways into the temporal lobes, pathways into the occipital lobes at the same time. Okay. We've also got some verbal processors on here. So Wernicke's area, which is the area of our brain that we use to actually process language, is on here as well. That's not going to help us a ton as we I'm going to target Wernicke's area. No, not in our instruction, but kind of thinking about maybe giving students a chance to process what's being said and not automatically moving on to the next thing, but giving them a chance to process it so that they can make the connections they need to make. That's a good reminder for the temporal lobes. And then finally, we've got those frontal lobes, right? So the frontal lobes, those huge beasts. This first fold here is your motor cortex. So this is the one where you want to do like purposeful movement of your body. So as opposed to the cerebella, which are going to take care of my walking and all this kind of thing. My motor cortex I would use if I'm going to reach for that object over there, right? I'm going to activate that using my motor cortex. And it's right there next to where we feel things on our bodies. So kind of fun. But all the rest of that is really about that planning and critical thinking and problem solving and all that kind of stuff. And as you're about to find out, that is the biggest area of development in adolescence. And so making sure that we're incorporating instruction that pushes the boundaries of those lobes while supporting them, right? So what we need to understand is they need to learn to use this part of their brain. So to regulate their emotion and to make plans for the future, like we talked about with metacognition, all that kind of stuff, you're going to help them learn how to use this. And again, if we can present problem-based activities and critical thinking and evaluation and those kinds of things into our lessons, that's going to, again, create more pathways across the brain. So as we really look at this whole thing, we can think about how within a single lesson or unit, we're trying to make sure that kids get verbal information, they're getting visual information, they're getting connections to themselves and their place in the world and things they're interested in, and we're kind of pushing the boundaries and trying to get them to think more abstractly and critically about what that content is and kind of what hypotheticals about what it could be used for, what could be done with it, etc. So that's going to allow us to create these neural networks and pathways all throughout the brain, really vastly improving motivation and the retention of the material and their understanding of the material. Okay. And then when you were in the interactive, we went ahead and talked about the hippocampus and the amygdala. But just a reminder on those, that the hippocampi are really about the size of your pinky fingers, okay? And that is your working memory kind of processor, the main piece of it, right? These little tiny guys. So we do have to be very careful about not overloading the working memory. Again, as we talked about with like the verbal processor, giving kids time to stop and think and reflect and process what's being said, we're going to need to do that with the hippocampi as well. Realize that that cognitive overload happens actually pretty quickly. So we need to be careful about kind of teaching in cycles, giving them some information and then stepping back and letting them work with it for a bit so that they can process it. And then we can introduce some more information. A researcher I met at one point called that the dance of education, that kind of I advance and then I retreat and then I advance again as I'm teaching my lesson. So we can keep that in mind for the hippocampus. And then the amygdala, of course, is attached right at the end of that hippocampal structure. So having that emotional connection, and there's no such thing as negative emotion as far as like anger is bad and happiness is good. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about facilitative versus debilitative levels of emotion. There's such a thing as too much joy in a classroom because it gets to the point where they're so happy and so hyper they're no longer learning the content. But there's also so much thing as too little anger, right? That if something really horrible is happening in the world, we should be angry about that. And that's actually going to facilitate our understanding of it and our willingness to act on it and our retention of that material and those kinds of things. So I'm really trying to help the kids make emotional connections with what we're learning. And in particular with the amygdala, talking about making sure that they feel safe. So whatever may be going on, whatever content we may be learning and the emotions we feel about that, we do need to make sure that our classroom is a safe place so we're not kind of sparking that fight or flight response that can happen from the amygdala as well. Okay. All right, so hopefully we got through all of your structures. If you have any questions, let me know. But that's kind of the overview I wanted to give you of these different structures in the brain and why we care about them in education.